During this tutorial, you will understand how the system manages to deliver trip requests to drivers, a process we refer to as trip allocation. To access this, click on the Settings button. On the left side of the menu, you will find the option labeled Trip. Within this, you will find various configurations. The first option is Trip Configuration. Under this, you will find a module we call Trip Allocation. Upon clicking on this, you will find 3 allocation options. The first one is one-to-one, where the trip request is delivered to all nearby drivers sequentially. For instance, if the first driver rejects the trip, the request is then sent to the second driver. If the second driver also rejects the trip, the request is sent to the third driver, and so forth. Within the one-to-one allocation, there are other configurations. One of these is the maximum number of requests that can be routed to drivers. When a trip request is generated, it is delivered to a predefined number of drivers simultaneously. For example, if a trip request is generated, the 10 drivers within a 10-kilometer radius will receive the trip request. The system administrator must define the search radius for finding drivers. This is important because there could potentially be hundreds of drivers online at the same time. However, we cannot deliver the trip request to all drivers simultaneously, as it would create a long queue for customers. Therefore, the admin can define the radius within which a trip request will be generated and how many drivers the system should find within that radius. Based on this radius, the system will determine how many drivers will receive the trip request. For example, there could be 50 or 60 drivers also online within this 10-kilometer radius. This could potentially create a large queue for customers. To manage this, there is an option to set the maximum number of requests that can be routed. So, if 10 drivers receive and reject the request, the system will inform the customer that no drivers are available. The customer can then make a request again and attempt to secure a ride. The final option is to set a request timeout in seconds. This determines how much time a driver gets to accept a trip once they receive the request. If we set it to 60 seconds, the system will allow the driver that duration to accept the trip request. This is how one-to-one trip allocation works. Moving on, another type of allocation is batch-wise. It's quite similar to one-to-one, but in this case, the system defines the number of batches that will be generated. If you've set it to 10 drivers, then 10 drivers will receive a request in a batch. If you've set the distance to 10 kilometers, then when a customer generates a trip request, 10 drivers will receive the request simultaneously. If you've defined 5 batches, then when a customer generates a request, 5 drivers will receive the request at the same time. We have defined the maximum number of drivers as 10, so 2 batches will be generated. The first batch will be for the first 5 drivers, and the second batch will be for the remaining 5 drivers. In this way, the trip request is generated in batches, with multiple drivers receiving the trip request at the same time. Any of these drivers can then accept the trip request. The last option is manual allocation. There is no specific configuration for manual trip allocation because when it is enabled, all trips are assigned by the admin. The admin decides which trip request will be assigned to which drivers. There are no boundaries because the admin defines which trip request will be assigned to which driver. This is how the 3 trip allocation modules work to assign a trip request to the drivers. Using these allocation types, the admin can decide the location type and increase the trip completion ratio. The drivers get a chance to accept the trip request because of this radius, which in turn increases their completion ratio. This is how the trip allocation section functions.